Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar as part of the IGES Institute webinar series. Today's webinar is about the importance of zero trust architecture. And we're going to talk about why this is important by discussing the lessons learned from tackling the Volt Typhoon attacks. Today's webinar, of course, is hosted by the IGES Institute with support from one of our newest member companies, Certus Networks. With me today on the webinar are two panelists, Simon Hill from Certus Networks and Lori Lee Ressler from Certus Networks. Simon Hill is the head of legal and compliance at Certus Networks, and Lori Lee is senior solutions architect. Before we get into the discussion and presentation on this very important topic, I just want to share a couple of housekeeping items. So from the webinar, you all will be muted, except the panelists. If you have any question during the webinar, please make sure you add those questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. It should be right next to the participants icon. And if you need anything else, please type in there and we will answer those questions after we are done with the presentation. So with that, I will turn over to Simon Hill to give you guys a quick overview on the Certus Networks, and then we'll get into the topic. So Simon Hill.
Thanks, Srini, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just a quick summary on Certus and what we do. We're in the data protection and risk mitigation space, focused on helping organizations take a data-centric approach to information security. And we do that with a number of unique ways where we're taking an approach where Certus DPRM secures the data itself as opposed to the underlying network infrastructure. And our customer base, we've been going for over 20 years. We have many customers in the public sector, both federal, state, and local government, finance, and other areas of critical infrastructure. And in the last 2 years, we've been working more closely with the utility sector as well. And in terms of the topic of what we're going to be talking about today, Volt Typhoon, it's something we've been paying a lot of attention to for around 18 months now. And to give a bit of background, I actually started working with a VP of Information Security of a well-known electric utility around 2 years ago. And we initially met at a utilities conference where we were both presenting. And at the time, the CISO had an initial interest in Certus for potentially looking at how it could secure cloud applications. And as we started working together, a use case actually changed, and different use case came up, which became a priority. And that was concern with a new wave of attacks, which the FBI, CISA, the Joint Cyber Advisory Committee kept talking about, with living off the land type attacks, were like the likes of Volt Typhoon, Alfie, Black Cat, were notorious to use. And as a result of that, Certus spent a lot of time evaluating some of the techniques, tactics, procedures used by the likes of Volt Typhoon and Alfie. How are they going about getting into the network? What is it they're doing once inside? And in terms of an actual use case, what could be done to actually protect data in such a way where attacks being used by the likes of Volt Typhoon could be mitigated and prevented. And that became a primary focus for Certus. And the end goal of that was the development of a use case which helps mitigate several of the key attack trajectories being deployed by Volt Typhoon and similar threat actors by securing Active Directory in such a way where it's essentially protected from being accessed by anyone other than the intended recipients. Now, Lori Lee will cover a little bit about that at the after I've started. What I wanted to do really was focus on what is the problem itself. What is Volt Typhoon? Who are they? What are they doing? And we're going to go through a few of the typical TTPs being deployed by Volt Typhoon and similar threat actors before we'll conclude with ideas on a use case on how we can best mitigate against it, which Lori Lee will cover. But let's really start off with So, okay, that's all interesting. Why should you care in the first place? Why is this important? Well, Volt Typhoon's got a lot of press coverage recently. Just last month, Christopher Wray, director of the FBI, you can see, spoke in Congress and said essentially, they're already here, they're already inside our networks. They're waiting for just the right moment to deal a devastating blow. So the first point I wanted to make was note that this isn't an IT compliance problem. This group's primary goal isn't to steal data for a ransom and make demands. They're there for one thing, to cause chaos, to get into an OT environment and bring it down. And they've been seen present within several areas of critical infrastructure over the last few years, including utilities, emergency services, aviation, pipelines, most recently water and sewage sectors. So why should we care? Because essentially their goal is to attack civilian infrastructure, which impacts you, me, everyone on the call, and everyone else. So regardless of what your role is, whether you're in IT, OT, security, project management, it really doesn't matter. I think some of the things we're going to cover really is how are they doing this? Hopefully the takeaway will be some useful points to take back in the office and can consider going forward. Now, in February of this year, CISA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, teamed up, but collectively known as the Joint Cybersecurity Advisory, teamed up and published a cybersecurity advisory setting out the key tactics, techniques, and procedures developed by Volt Typhoon. And they point out that there's evidence indicating Volt Typhoon's presence in some target environments for as long as up to 5 years. So it's a problem. They're here. It's not a question of if, but when. Last week, 2 weeks ago, sorry, the annual RSA conference, Volt Typhoon was again a hot topic, and I just wanted to share a few comments and quotes from some of the cybersecurity advisory leaders out there from the likes of CISA. And you can see, starting off with Eric Goldstein, essentially said, they're not just targeting the largest critical infrastructure operators. They're targeting everyone, a broadband, including small and medium-sized companies that may not represent critical infrastructure itself, but they're seen as a critical part of the individual supply chain, are also in scope. Morgan Adamski from the US Cyber Command, she pointed out essentially that problem is, as we're going to see in a few minutes, the techniques that they're using, living off the land techniques, they're very subtle, they're very covert. It's not like you all of a sudden see a mass volume of data being extracted to raise suspicions. They go undetected because really you don't notice anything with the techniques that they're using. Morgan herself first came across Volt Typhoon back in 2021, investigating a breach and incident at the port of Houston, where it was later found to be a Volt Typhoon attack, where they'd compromised Pulse Secure, VPN owned by Avanti. Andrew Scott, also of CISA, pointed out that actually the way that they're getting in initial access, compromising networking infrastructure, which we'll talk about in a second, means they're absolutely everywhere. They're targeting all sorts of connectivity, routers, gateways, private servers. Main point he raised is once they've compromised that device, there's a strong likelihood they have access to other important areas of your network, given the techniques which we know they use. And then lastly, there was a comment which I found amusing on segmentation. I know it was pointed out by Cynthia Kaiser, Deputy Director of the FBI, that a lot of people think, I'm okay, my OT environment's isolated, it's air-gapped, it's ring-fenced, everything's locked down. How many times have we all heard that? Well, Volt Typhoon are pretty adept at this, and they're very good, as we'll see in a second, at moving laterally through networks, even environments where organizations thought they were generally segmented from each other. They're able to use techniques and tactics to identify links between those networks that actually turns out aren't so isolated. They're able to find common points between networks and bridge them. So bottom line is it's getting a lot of interest, and it's getting that for a reason. It's a threat not in theory, it's very real. So what I wanted to cover over the next few minutes this afternoon is start off really with an overview of the typical Volt Typhoon kill chain. What is it they are doing? When are they doing it? How are they doing it at a high level? And I want to touch on what we mean by living off the land techniques. They're notorious for using it. What does that mean by that? Because it's becoming much more common these days. And then we're really going to close up with a use case, which helps essentially mitigate one of the key risks in Volt Typhoon's kill chain, which is accessing Active Directory for total domain control takeover. And we're going to look at how it can also be mitigated from a zero trust data access perspective. So those are the outcomes I'm looking to achieve over the next few minutes. Starting off then with the methods used for initial access. How are Volt Typhoon getting inside networks in the first place? What are the, from a high level perspective, what are some of the key TTPs that we're seeing them deploy initially? Well, first thing to point out is Volt Typhoon conducts extensive discovery and reconnaissance before getting access in the first place to really learn about their target environment, the organization's network architecture, the operational protocols in place. Once they've done their due diligence, they're going to know how many users are there, some typical user behaviors, what are they, what security tools are in use. They've even been known to target personal emails of some of the key network and IT staff in order to conduct a full reconnaissance. One piece of information they will have to hand as a result of their discovery, reconnaissance, is information gathering regarding vulnerabilities in networking appliances. And recent reporting has shown that they keep a close watch on public disclosures of CVEs, and they manage to immediately exploit the vulnerabilities before many users get a chance to patch them. So what do we mean exactly by exploiting vulnerabilities? Well, by definition, an exploit takes advantage of a bug or a vulnerability in order to cause an unintended or an unanticipated behavior. And what this can lead essentially is to one of two things: bypassing authentication or somehow managing to access valid credentials that have been exposed as a result of the vulnerability. So looking at bypassing authentication, this essentially means they can gain unauthorized access to the system without needing a valid user credential. So basically find a flaw in the system security that allows them to skip the login process altogether. Or in other cases, exploiting vulnerabilities may not directly bypass authentication, but it can lead to exposure or theft of valid user credentials. So a vulnerability, for example, could allow an attacker to intercept and steal login credentials as they're transmitted over the network or stored insecurely on the system itself. With the stolen credentials, they can obviously then gain unauthorized access to the system or the network. And we're seeing the term being used today, which I quite like. Bad actors, they're not breaking anymore, breaking in, they're logging in. And that's essentially representative of the living off the land type technique, which we'll get to in a second. Having gained initial access, though, it's fairly limited for two reasons. One, the segment that they compromise is unlikely to have anything of value. It's just an initial foothold. The data accessible won't enable them to achieve their end goal. Remember the likes of Volt Typhoon, if we're viewing their end goal as getting inside an OT environment and causing mass havoc, that initial point of entry for a compromised VPN isn't going to cut it. So what they can get is of limited value. And secondly, they're actually very vulnerable after initial access. That initial area of compromise, that initial access is likely to be cut off through system updates, password changes, just being noticed from tools in the system. So quickly, what they need to do is move from initial access to persistent access. Remember I said some cases we've seen them in networks for up to 5 years. So these guys are really very good at the persistent access. And that's where we come to the living off the land techniques. But just before that, an example where we talk about vulnerabilities in network infrastructure of today, we're seeing them now all the time. I only need to look back to last month. Two major headlines would be Cisco Duo, where third-party data breaches were essentially possible off the back of multi-factor authentication logs being exposed through a vulnerability. We also saw last month Palo Alto zero-day flaws exploited through a Python backdoor. In this case, once again, the vulnerability, i.e. the thing that wasn't anticipated, the bug, so to speak, led to a vulnerability which allowed remote code execution and privilege escalation in a firewall. So essentially, off the back of those vulnerabilities, the bad actors got the ability to log in. They don't have to break in, and they're going unnoticed because they're using credentials or they're bypassing authentication. So that's the problem with initial access. And then moving off to the living off the land, what do we mean by that? I know it's being talked about a lot in recent journals and press articles. It originates really from the concept of surviving in the wilderness by utilizing resources ready available in nature. So someone generally surviving in the wilderness doesn't have supplies of them, doesn't have conveniences and commodities. They have to find water somewhere, find shelter, find food. And in the context of cybersecurity, it refers to attackers relying on the resources that are present within the target environment, as opposed to introducing external or custom-built tools and scripts. And the reason that they're using those custom tools that are already there is a number of reasons, but essentially they're able to remain in the target environment, blending in by using legitimate tools and techniques. They can blend in with normal system activity. They can avoid detection by security monitoring tools. And since they're using tools to do their evil deeds that are commonly used by system administrators and legitimate users, what this means is it leaves minimal forensic evidence compared to traditional malware-based attacks, right? So very hard to be aware of them. And it leaves very few artifacts or traces behind that can be used for further analysis or incident response. So we're struggling to learn much about their behaviors because of this. So using these built-in functionalities native to the operating system or software applications, the attackers can blend in with normal system activity, essentially. So what do we mean by legitimate tools? What is it they're using and abusing? So in the last year or so, a lot of the reports have shown PowerShell in particular being abused. WMI, Python, system administrator tools are all examples of what they call living off the land binaries. So again, they're leveraging legitimate binaries or execute, software tools, utilities which are present on the standard system to go about executing malicious commands. Very close to that, the other area is credential dumping. So this is again where they're finding further vulnerabilities in systems to extract credentials stored on a system to elevate privileges and move laterally within a network. So you could write a whole book on this and have a whole session on the different types of credential theft that are out there. But credential dumping is, well, one of the most prevalent ones we've seen lately and used by Volt Typhoon. And it essentially uses tools like Mimikatz to extract passwords from memory or accessing credential database stored on compromised systems. And I just wanted to give a quick sort of scenario and example. Let's have a fictitious scenario with PowerShell, because I mentioned that's commonly abused these days. And let's say a threat actor, his initial tactic is he wants to somehow get inside the network and find PowerShell, because if he can take over PowerShell, he's got a pretty good method of getting to Active Directory, which for him holds the keys to the kingdom. So how, high level could this sort of thing go about? Well, let's just say he's found his target and he wants to find a utility running outdated software for their web server, because he's pretty good at getting around that. So he uses automated scanning and he discovers a known vulnerability in a target's web server software. And that allows for some initial remote code execution. So he sees the vulnerability and he starts playing around and interacting it. Now he wants to start thinking about, what can we do? How do I exploit the vulnerability? So let's say the threat actor uploads a web shell to the compromised web server, providing them with remote access to the server's file system and command execution capabilities. Okay, so having done all of that, he now wants to learn a bit more and do discovery, the reconnaissance of the network. What else is out there? So he's inside the compromised web server. He conducts discovery to identify other systems and resources within that corporate network. Eventually, he discovers a domain-joined workstation used by IT administrators, which, as it turns out, has PowerShell installed, and PowerShell is accessible to him. So this is what we mean by an example of use of those legitimate tools, which now he's going to abuse. So how does he go about abusing it? Well, having used the compromised web server as a pivot point, a threat actor gains access to the domain-joined workstation using stolen credentials he's got. And now with access to the workstation, he opens up a PowerShell session to begin his activities. And he starts off with crafting a script to basically create new user accounts with elevated privileges to become a member of the domain admins group, because that's going to be very helpful for his next step. And essentially, by using legitimate commands native to the organization, things like new add user, he can very quickly add a user account to the Active Directory domain. Now, what's he done? He's essentially elevated privileges and added new accounts. So he's going to exploit the privilege. Using PowerShell, he's then going to exploit misconfigurations of vulnerabilities and things like Windows services or other applications that he's found are running with elevated privileges to gain administrative access. So with those elevated privileges from the workstation, he's using PowerShell remotely to pivot to other systems which are connected to this large corporate environment. And essentially, from a high-level perspective, he's going to spend time exploiting other trust relationships, finding weak access controls to ultimately access systems with further sensitive data that eventually will give him what he needs to move laterally to Active Directory. So that's a high-level fictional example, but it's representative of the sorts of things that we're seeing happen, right? So to summarize, having gained initial access, they need persistent access. And because they're vulnerable from their initial part. So they need to move laterally. They need to find a credential to do something. In this case, we're seeing a good example of lateral movement. He got to PowerShell, which enabled privilege escalation, enabled them to move further along to find more credentials to eventually get into Active Directory. So I want to go from that high-level perspective to an overview of the actual Volt Typhoon kill chain, because we said that they're using vulnerabilities in network appliances to get initial access, and they've said they're using living off the land techniques. So let's apply some of those to a known route for Volt Typhoon. Now, we'll say up front, obviously their methods change on each target, and there's a variance. They mix it up each time, but from CISA and the FBI's advisory note, this is an established typical kill chain that we've seen them deploy. So having gained that initial access we talked about earlier, whether that's through a router, firewall, VPN, they now need to maintain that persistence in the network. And one of the first things they'll start looking for is vulnerabilities in some of the applications, operating systems, and public-facing appliances that they're now exposed to. Volt Typhoon is known for going after unsecured credentials, so credentials that have either not been secured properly or become exposed through a misconfiguration or something like that. So what they're essentially now trying to do is indirectly interact essentially with the authentication system. So instead of having to directly get into the system that they need, that there's targets, they're going to go about it indirectly by abusing other systems which can lead up to it. Multiple ways, again, of doing this. As I said earlier, there's multiple tactics, techniques, and procedures they're using under the umbrella of credential access. Some of the things are going to involve credentials stored in plain text files or credentials in the Windows registry. One actual example found in the Volt Typhoon kill chain was Fortinet's FortiGate, which was compromised. And this is, again, a VPN using SSL or TLS to essentially create encrypted tunnels with the purpose of ensuring that any data transmitted between the remote user and the corporate network is secure. However, as we saw in the FortiGate vulnerability, it was exploited by Volt Typhoon. Once those credentials are compromised, it's a problem. And the good point here is I know a lot of critical infrastructure operators assume that because a VPN tunnel is encrypting the data flowing across it, that data is secure. But as we're now seeing time and time again, that isn't the case. There's a difference between securing the data inside the tunnel and securing the connectivity itself, because once the security has been bypassed by stealing those credentials through whatever method it was being used, that data itself is now very vulnerable, which is exactly what we've seen Volt Typhoon essentially do. So in step 2 here, they found that vulnerability in a public-facing appliance to get more credentials using things like credential dumping, to then elevate more privileges to become a higher rights user who can then move into further segments of the network. So once they've got that initial access and they're trying to maintain persistence, they've essentially got very low privilege access rights. They can't really do much, they can't access much, they can't see much. But at stage 2, they're looking for vulnerabilities. They're trying to find something in the operating system components or software running at a high permission where something hasn't quite been done correctly, whether it's a misconfiguration or just a bug. And they're going to take advantage of that to, again, either bypass authentication or steal the credentials which have been exposed to enable them to do so. So this is just typically going to enable someone to move from being an unprivileged or a user level permission based to system or root permissions, depending on the components they find in that attack that are vulnerable. It can enable an adversary to move from a virtualized environment, such as a virtual machine or container, onto the underlying host. Now, having established what they need to in this area, let's say now they've got what they wanted, which was essentially credentials of the domain administrator, because the next part of the attack is they want to get to Active Directory, ultimately for full domain control, okay? So how do they do that? Well, they've stolen domain administrator credentials, various methods of doing it. The one we've seen become more prominent is lately from Volt Typhoon and other threat actors is exploiting remote services. So finding remote services and abusing them, things like remote desktop protocol. Having gained those valid administrator credentials, they're acting as if they were the domain administrator, and they're using those connection points to move deeper into the network and ultimately get to Active Directory. But actually, before they get there, they do more discovery. I mentioned they quite like their discovery and their reconnaissance. They're very covert. They don't pull the trigger straight away, even though they could do if they wanted. There's some more work to do, and they've been seen to do a lot of discovery by once again abusing PowerShell at this point. So they've been seen to use PowerShell to perform targeted queries on Windows event logs, focusing on specific users and periods. And these queries facilitate the discrete extraction of security event logs, right? So not only does this, remember I talked about earlier, this minimizes the trail that they've left behind, the evidence that they're even there. They leave very little for the organization to learn on how are they doing it. They're getting rid of their evidence as they move along. And that's why they're taking their time to do it before pulling the trigger. Ultimately, Active Directory, what do they want to do? They want to get that ntds.dit file from the domain controller, because once they've got that, they literally have the keys to the kingdom. Various things they can do based on their motive, but as we've seen with Volt Typhoon, according to the advice out there, their goal is to get into the OT environment and bring that down. So we haven't got time today to talk about how they get from AD to that OT environment, but they've essentially got all sorts of user credentials with elevated privileges, i.e. VPN access to the SCADA environment to blend in as a trusted user. And one of the really clever things they do is a technique called volume shadow copy service, which is really important because they're sneaking in when they're getting this file. Typically, Active Directory's got lots of protection in it, given the data it has. And normally, you wouldn't be able to access certain things when the network's up and running. But what they do to get around the usual barriers, which would prevent access to the ntds.dit file, is they essentially make a shadow copy, again, so no one's aware of it, essentially taking a snapshot of the file, which lets them get the goods without getting caught, again, using more covert procedures. And I wanted to link this into the PICUS reports. For those of you who know, the PICUS Retreat from the Pokemon Institute produces a yearly report on the MITA framework and looks at which TTPs are prevalent, which are emerging, what should we be concerned about. And last year's 123, a lot of the key things, I think the 5 summary key threats they talked about, for those that have read it, really relate to exactly the sorts of things we've just seen. They said lateral movement is on the rise as attackers utilize new as well as tried and tested techniques. So in order to facilitate lateral movement, we saw remote services, remote system discovery being increased to abuse remote services. Things like remote desktop protocol is being used more, which is allowing lateral movement to succeed. Identity and credentials are the new perimeter, they said. Traditional perimeter security is no longer good enough. And they pointed out that credential dumping moved up to the Red Report list as number 2 threat in terms of most prominent increasing attacks. Essentially, as we mentioned earlier, Volt Typhoon user, it allows attackers to obtain login and credential information from compromised machines. And that information can be used to move laterally, access other applications, elevate privileges, and so on. And they also talked about the dark side of legitimate tools now, that their adversaries are weaponizing legitimate software in cyber attacks. And PowerShell had been mentioned as a common target of something that gets abused. And we gave a fictitious example of why someone would abuse that, what they can do with it, and so on. Also, when you're looking at another threat actor out there, Alfie Black Cat, they were the group responsible for the $22 million ransom recently on United Health Change Healthcare. Whilst they wanted to go for money, their motivation was different. It was a ransom demand they were after. The attack methods were very similar to Volt Typhoons, lots of living off the land type techniques, and Active Directory was specifically targeted to give them the keys to the kingdom to get the data that they needed to demand a ransom. They needed to get into Active Directory, which they did, and they did that via a golden ticket attack. Now, I mentioned earlier about when I first started working on this, it was with a customer, a colleague, where what was keeping him up at night was the likes of Black Cat, Alfie, Volt Typhoon. The fact that they're getting inside a system, they're stealing credentials, no one can see they're there, no one's aware of them. There's hundreds of TTPs in all the advisories. How do I even start mitigating against something? And we've known about this. I've got a slide there from the FBI 2 years ago, over 2 years ago. These warnings have been out there. Active Directory's been a target for a long time. They're trying to get inside that. They're abusing PowerShell. So this is nothing new. Volt Typhoon's using emerging techniques that have been there for a while. They just happen to be very, very good at it. So Active Directory in this case is a key target that's compromised because of all of the valuable information it can get. Now, most people would think, well, Active Directory is locked down. There's no way to get to it. Well, there's multiple methods. There's the overview of the kill chain we've just looked at with Volt Typhoon. I saw last week a document with over 50 key threats to Active Directory. Main ones we're seeing: DC sync attacks, golden ticket attacks, DC shadow attacks. List is endless. It's pointless talking about those now, because you may find a way of mitigating a certain threat. What's Volt Typhoon and others going to do? Find another way around. Well, they'll find another way through. And this leads us really to the use case I wanted to talk about, because the challenge a customer had when we sat down in a boardroom 18 months ago was, here's the problem. I can't solve something where there's numerous TTPs evolving on a daily basis. Look at initial access alone. There's 12 or 13 problematic TTPs. Each of those has 4 to 5 suggested mitigations. That's building up to over 60 suggested mitigations for one part of an attack. Don't have the budget to do all of that, don't have the time, it's too complicated. And by even, let's say, I've done all of that, they're going to find another way of getting in. So this reactive approach isn't really working. Let's take a different approach, and more of an offensive approach, which looks at what is it they're really after. Let's scale it back. Okay, they want to get into the OT network. What do they need to do that? They need to get inside Active Directory. Okay, and what comes before that? And the before Active Directory saw it becomes problematic because you're not going to stop someone getting inside the network. You're not going to stop them exploiting vulnerabilities once they're inside the network. So let's look at what can be really done to protect the areas that we're most concerned with and take an offensive defensive architecture, which essentially led us to working on a use case where we acknowledged that it's likely the network had already been breached. So we need to be able to protect Active Directory in such a way where we're assuming that credentials have been breached. And we're not, so it's important to not base data access to Active Directory that can't be based on network access, because we know that network's been breached. We know that they're clever. They found a way to get domain controllers' credentials. They've got all of that. So in that worst case scenario, they're about to get inside AD, mess around, exfiltrate the database. What do we do to protect it from there from a data protection perspective? And that was a challenge the team at Certes was faced with. And I wanted Laura-Lee to spend just a couple of minutes, not talking about Certes per se, but how a use case was built with some out-of-the-box thinking, which took a different approach. It wasn't saying, how can I mitigate these and prevent these risks? It's more, okay, where's my most important data in my organization that's a priority, and how do I focus on protecting that against this threat? And that's exactly what we did. So Laura-Lee, over to you, if you don't mind.
Great. Thank you, Simon. Before I get into the Volt Typhoon use case, I really wanted to give just a high-level overview of what we're talking about with DPRM, which is data protection and risk mitigation. There's two major components of DPRM. One is crypto segmentation, and one is customer-controlled policy and key management. The crypto segmentation piece. Now, we talk about network segmentation, and there's certainly a foundation of zero trust. But when we're talking about, as Simon was mentioning, and the vulnerabilities in the network appliances, the privilege escalation, we're using those same appliances to apply data security to it. So we can assume that this is not going to work. And you can tell by, the ongoing data breaches that we're having, we need to have a different mentality about how we're going to protect our data. So it's not about the network per se. The bad actors aren't trying to steal the network. They're trying to steal your data. So segmentation is certainly a cornerstone of zero trust. But where DPRM comes in is the application of cryptography at the segmentation level. We're living in a data-centric world. It's going to the cloud. It's going to really everywhere across network infrastructures, going across the globe. And network teams can really have only so much control of the data as it travels, between point A and point B. As a result, there are sections of that journey that are vulnerable to where data can be targeted and extracted. So DPRM solves this problem by applying security to the one thing that you do have control over, which is your data. So with DPRM, each application data flow will have this, different level of sensitivity and value to a customer. So, traditional technologies, we're running them down as a single tunnel, treating all the data exactly the same, really is not a very good approach, because a bad actor can have total lateral movement within the environment, have access to all your data, and of course through the vulnerabilities and privilege escalation, just living off the land and getting all your data. So with DPRM, each application data flow has his own set of protection, its own set of data encryption keys. And it's separate from every other data flow that's going across the network, because each application data flow has its own set of encryption keys. DPRM crypto segmentation uses customer control policies to define what is protected, how it's protected, and how often the protection is refreshed for every individual data flow without creating any network tunnels or impacting the network device. It's also totally transparent to the network infrastructure. So it's giving you that visibility. You're still enabled to use your network monitoring tools and your reporting tools as well. So it's very important that it doesn't interrupt the existing security and networking stack, but also being able to apply that security to the data itself, regardless what the underlying infrastructure is. And the second component, major component, is the customer control policies and key management. to truly protect and ensure that only the organization and the intended recipient can access that data, you must separate the policies and key management from the delivery of the network transport. Again, that's going back to the vulnerabilities within your infrastructure, privilege escalations, things like that. In fact, separation of duties is becoming a mandated requirement in sectors such as utilities, governments. We're seeing this with sieges as well, and it's rapidly being adopted as a best practice within the enterprise environment. The separation of duties is the ultimate in zero trust. So DPRN allows you to have policy and key management and cryptography over any network, no matter where that data is traveling. In addition, establishing customer control key management allows organizations to retain full ownership and control over their data, minimizing the risks associated with third parties or shared network infrastructure. Many people think MPLS is a secure environment. It's actually a private network. It's not providing any type of data security at all, and it could be easily misconfigured. So this is what we're talking about, wrapping that data with security. So it is, so that any traveling over a third party, you don't have to worry about the data being breached, because it would be useless to any bad actor. And just moving into the Active Directory use case. This is what we're talking about, with our, with this use case is the Volt Typhoon. Critical, assets like Active Directory domain controller database should be independently protected in a way that ensures critical infrastructure can retain control of the integrity of their sensitive data. Network access should never equate data access, and this is the approach we've been, working on historically, for 20 years. So it's essential to have policies based upon the data itself and the source and destination of where it's going and where it's coming from. So within this particular use case, what we're enabling our customer to do is to segment the writable domain controller, build a wall essentially around it, segment it from the rest of the from all other devices unless it's needed. Push all the traffic to the read-only data controller with individual policies, individual sets of keys for each policy workflow, between the read-only domain controller and the and the end users, and only allowing updates between the read-only domain controller and the writable domain controller, and dropping everything else. So we are enabling our our customers to create and define policies to protect that data flow, but also to to legitimize access to this data, and either encrypting or dropping traffic that is falling outside of any policies that are created or approved. So for instance, if there's a source or a destination that doesn't match a policy, that data is dropped or encrypted. And as you can see from my diagram, that through the DPRM solution, any data that falls outside of a policy that's been defined, that's being queried, that's being requested, is delivered encrypted, as you can see the bad actor in my diagram here. So it's really a game changer in the way we're thinking about things. Again, moving away from the network perimeter and moving at and really looking at that data and securing that data so that our customers' critical infrastructure is running optimally. There's a lot more to it, but this is really what really is the crux of the Zero Trust and DPRM, is the fact that they're enabling our customers to have that proactive, offensive, defensive approach to their data security, as well as protecting their Active Directory, as well as any other critical data that's running across their network.
Thanks, Laurie. And so really just to recap and finish up, I wanted to go full circle and bring this back to reflecting on the whole notion of a zero trust architecture. And I've outlined here from the very beginning, NIST's first publication those years ago, what were the key objectives of the zero trust architecture, what they're trying to recognize. It's really that threats exist both outside and inside the network. A breach is going to happen if it hasn't done already. So when we're looking at the living off the land tactics we've just explored, they're getting inside the network. The breaches are happening all the time. So Zero Trust talked about the concept of least privilege, the fact that make sure that resources only have access to resources, staff only have access to resources absolutely necessary to fulfill their role, which is why least privilege is a key concept of a zero trust architecture. And now you see from the living off the land techniques why that's important with all of the privilege escalation and credential theft that the Volt Typhoon and others are trying to achieve. It's really important. And the Active Directory use case is a good example of least privilege by ensuring that not all domain controllers have writable permissions, because not every location needs them. So locks them down to the read-only. And it really talks about shifting from location-centric model to a data-centric approach for fine-grained controls. And what do they mean by that? Well, it's the whole point around network access shouldn't equal data access. They're finding ways of getting in, pretending to be the domain controller. So what Zero Trust is saying, that alone shouldn't be the trigger to grant or authenticate trust, because that location may still not be the person that it's supposed to be. So shifting to a data-centric approach is really important, according to NIST's framework. And our use case gives just one example of how that can be done by creating policies which define access based on things like where the location of the traffic is going to is important, because rather than just relying on the credentials which could have been stolen, if you define a policy based on destination, bad traffic, malicious traffic will be identified very quickly, because the domain administrator, if it really is him or her, they are not going to be sending traffic on the open internet to the Exchange server at their end. That is the footprint of Volt Typhoon or a bad actor. So that's an example of taking a data-centric approach for fine-grained controls. And on that, we'll finish here. There was something we were going to cover on, more on that zero trust architecture and what we mean by data-centric approach, but we'll save that for another time because I wanted to save time for some questions. So, Srini, I think I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Lorelei. So if folks have any questions, please type it in Q&A, and we'll Phil on our team will monitor it. So while people are thinking about their questions, Simon and Lorelei, I have a question for you, and this is something that we have been discussing, especially in context of justice and public safety. I'm going to just focus on that mission here for a second. You talk about separation of duties. We know that at this time, we do trust. We have a trust within our community. We trust each other, and we share our passwords and everything else, right? And even as we're developing the application, can you talk a little bit more about when we use the term separation of duties, what that looks like in the justice and public safety community, or what is the scenario that can clearly explain what the separation of duty concept looks like?
Well, I'll try and give one close to home then, for I know a lot of the members of IGES have to comply with the CJIS security policy. And so that would be a good example of one where the most recent version of the security policy, which comes into effect in October, talks about new requirements for encryption key management. And I believe it says something along the lines of agencies should ensure that when they're encrypting CGI in transit, to meet the existing requirement that's been there for years, do so in a way where processes are in place so that access to encryption keys is solely under the control of the agency, i.e. meaning third parties outside of the agency, their service providers, shouldn't be accessing policies or encryption keys, because that can lead them to getting a hold of unencrypted CGI. So in the context of a separation of duties in that instance, what we're saying is the means of securing the data should be separate from the underlying network infrastructure. And the reason for that is the individuals managing the network infrastructure, A, are likely to be an outside party, B, in a lot of circumstances, they're networking professionals, they're not security professionals. So changes made at the network level, configuration changes can lead to a configuration of from a security perspective, because there isn't a separation. The implementation of a key security policy is embedded in a networking device managed by a network team. There is a lack of separation. So what a separation of duties in that context should mean, as the CGIS policy is asking for, is the management of whatever it is implementing and managing the encryption keys should be set. Well, they use the words under the control of the agency, which i.e. means not allowing a third-party service provider to have access to it. In that case, it should be under the security function of the agency, not under the function of a third-party managed service provider.
Simon, thanks for that clarification. I'm glad you picked that example. So my next question to you is that as we're looking at the third-party encryption key management and ownership now residing within the agency or the organization, who is basically going to be the holder. So is this also going to apply to the cloud-based, as you know that we have a big movement going on in the justice and public safety mission where a lot of our solution sets are now being deployed in cloud, right? So we're taking from our own organizations, our own agencies, four walls, and deploying in the cloud. So how that actually is going to work in the cloud?
I believe that requirement was there already. That was, so I think the last iteration of end of last year brought a new update, which meant when CGI is essentially traversing a cloud provider's infrastructure, that they need to have the separation of duties around the key management. Now the latest version is saying, actually, it's all CGI. So that was already there. I think the clouds are really, I mean, there's a whole lot we can talk about, but from a separation of duties perspective, just in general, for any data, whether it's CGI or something else, it's, okay, so you've now outsourced essentially the connectivity, the handling of your network to that third party. It's in the cloud. How do you then ensure that there's still that separation where you as the data owner still have, how do you now retain control over those sensitive data flows and have that separation where you're not relying on the cloud provider to do the job of securing your data? And that's important. I know a lot of organizations may say, well, we outsource all of that.
Yeah.
We often say to them, but okay, but how do you outsource then your risk management, your liability? Because legally you can't do that. If you breach a load of your customers' healthcare data, they're going to come at your organization and the cloud provider potentially, but you can't outsource that liability. So the question is, how do you separate out the two, control and integrity of your data, as opposed to what that cloud provider is doing? And we could have a whole session on that in itself, which really can't provide an answer to it. Just it's that identifying where the separation is important, I think, would be.
Yeah, and Simon, you're absolutely, and that's what we're hoping that we can get somebody from BSC, just like Chris Weatherly, to participate in the discussion, because we know that question is absolutely being asked. So we have a couple of questions in our Q&A. So the first question is from Jess Colvin. Are there any credible statistics out there that speak to the amount of cybersecurity spending companies will need to allocate in order to address threats like Volt Typhoon?
So I might use the lifeline of phone a friend on this one. I know our CTO is on the call as an attendee. Srini, will he be able to be unmuted? Because I think Simon Pumprin might be able to answer.
Phil, can we unmute Simon? Other Simon.
Yeah.
Right there, Simon.
I think he's able to now if he wants to unmute. Hi, Simon.
Sorry to throw you in the deep end there, Simon, but I know some of the work you've been doing, you might have a better take on that than I do.
So Simon, you're on.
Yeah, no problem, Simon. So can you hear me, Srini?
Yes.
Yeah, so the last stats I had from Gartner was around data security, and predictions rate that for every £1 spent in network security, there's going to be $2.8 rather spent on data security. So nearly 3 times the budget is projected to be spent on data security than traditional network security, which kind of gives you the impression of how important people are realizing this is becoming. So that's probably the most independent, up-to-date data I've got on that.
And the reason for that, Jesse, is I think we're seeing cyber spend now not come out of a typical IT budget or be an IT problem. We're seeing it be it's it's a boardroom problem, and so it comes out of a budget associated with risk mitigation, and so that has deeper pockets than traditional IT spend.
Sure. So the next question is from Alex McAdoo. What is the best way to set up a virtual private network for secure remote access without giving any vulnerability to unauthorized access?
Okay, I'll let one of the techies answer that one. So Laurie Lee or Simon, whoever.
Laurie Lee.
You're on mute, Laurie Lee.
I am, thank you. That's a really great question. So for the remote access piece, I mean, there's a number of different things that I would, do. One, of course, multi-factor authentication, very important. Secondly, patching, making sure everything is patched, very important. These are just hygiene type of things. I would probably limit split tunneling if that's, enabled. And of course, having strict policies and having, encryption over the network. I don't know if Simon Pamplin has any other insight on that or not.
Yeah, sorry, just unmuting myself. So yeah, we'd also be looking to extend the capabilities of DPRM out to the edge. So whether that's sort of VPN concentrator or whether that's actually to the edge location with the edge devices, it really comes down to how you define your policies. So we're not really bothered about what infrastructure or techniques you're using to connect to a network. We're really focused on the data itself. So with the CERTIS enforcement points and the policies that Simon and Laurie have described, that gives you true end-to-end protection of the data, irrespective of the type of connectivity that you're going over.
And I'll answer from that point of compliance perspective very quickly and bring up least privilege again. It's amazing how many organizations where you have users with valid credentials in play on a live system, things like a VPN where that employee may have needed that access at some point in time. They left the organization 3 years ago, but that account's still there. So, hygiene from that perspective is important as well from ongoing management.
Thank you so much for answering that. So I know we're almost at top of the hour. So Simon, Laurie Lee, and Simon Pamplin, thanks for jumping in. Thanks for doing this presentation. As everybody can see, there's just so much to talk about, and we're definitely going to have a separate conversation on zero trust, but also what it means, especially if I go back to justice and public safety, with the new CJIS security policy that is coming out with some of the changes that have been approved and will be rolled out. So you can see there's a lot of dialogue that needs to happen. So on that note, I will encourage everybody as part of the IJIS webinar series to listen in and register for the webinar. We have another one coming up tomorrow that happens to be on CJIS security policy 5.9.4, where our friends at FBS CJIS will be doing the presentation, especially Chris Weatherly will be on. And then also as part of the webinar series, we have another one that is scheduled in June, on June 13th, on detection technology. As we know, with some of the things that are happening across the nation, as what we are observing, especially with the campus protest and things that are happening, we will be presenting some of the concept is how to utilize detection technology to manage incident management and incident response. So I will encourage everyone to sign in. And if you have any topics that you would like to suggest, please send us a note. So with that, once again, thanks to the CERTIS team for jumping in and doing this presentation. And if you have any questions on this topic, please send it to myself or Phil. We will take those questions and make sure you get the answers to those questions. With that, we'll conclude this webinar. Thanks and have a good day.